Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, what the last 2 weeks of presidential campaigning means for Arizona. The last 2 weeks of the presidential campaign will be ones that show up in history books. A gunman tried to kill Donald Trump at a rally, and then President Joe Biden announced, a little more than 100 days before the election, that he was withdrawing from the race for the White House. Biden quickly threw his support behind Vice President Kamala Harris, and while most of the nation watched with interest, Arizona voters may have had even more of a raised eyebrow to all the goings-on because Senator Mark Kelly was immediately mentioned as being seriously considered as a running mate for Harris. Given that Arizona voted for Biden 4 years ago and the race is close here now, though leaning for Trump, what do all of these things mean? Joining us to try and make sense of it all is Mike Noble with Phoenix-based Noble Predictive Insights.
This is made for TV, this election. I've been around this a while. I think it's my 8th or 9th election cycle going through, and I feel like I've seen it all. And I ain't seen nothing yet after watching this election because, and here's the thing. If people thought it's been crazy so far, well, guess what? I have news for them. We got 4 months left, and it's going to get weirder before it gets more normal.
So let's talk about Arizona. 4 years ago, went for Biden. Just barely. Last time a Democrat had done that was President Clinton. Now, and you're a pollster, so you know this, the state is leaning back Republican towards Donald Trump. But now we bring Kamala Harris into it. I know, because you and I talked earlier in the week, you're not hard polling on this yet, but what are you hearing on the street, so to speak, when it comes to all of this in Arizona, which is now a swing state?
We have polled Arizona more than anyone else in the country. So I would say that basically right now, where I assess the race is that Kamala Harris, even though they're switching out Biden for Harris, she's basically starting in the same position as Biden is, which is behind. So, as you correctly called out, Biden barely won, and no Democrats done that in a while, by 11,000 votes. So a lot of things align for that to happen. However, on average right now, Trump's up about, around 4 or 5 points in Arizona, which is pretty good. Anything over 4 points basically is usually a better spot to be in. If you're only 1 or 2, I mean, it's really close, right? So it basically safe spot. And what's interesting is, and you see that not only in our Arizona polling, because we always ask the president's fave, unfave, and Kamala Harris. And we've done it ever since they've been in office. And so you look at our polling, but also national polling, you'll notice Kamala Harris has the same exact favorability numbers as Joe Biden does, which are not good. Mind you, I think it's 1/3 of Arizonans have a favorable opinion, where over 50%, it's around 54%, 55%, have an unfavorable opinion. So among those that have an opinion, it's -20. So what's interesting, swapped it out, and I've seen there has been some early polling, because this news only happened just this past Sunday. Quinnipiac came out some polling, Emerson, a couple others. And basically you saw that the race got slightly tighter in, let's say, the Midwest states, so like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. But in the Sun Belt, hasn't really changed. But when you look at the demographics, Trump's still ahead in all of those key battleground states. I think he was tied in Wisconsin. But, other than that, I mean, it's still Kamala starting in a back foot position. And it's going to be tougher for her in Arizona, I think, compared to the other battleground states. For the unique factor, we are a border state. And she was in head of the border team when she was in the administration. And there's been a lot of talks and questions about what borders are, whatever you want to call it, with that. And so Arizona is going to be a tough nut for Kamala to crack, but she's also not starting out in a great position.
Of course, adding to the Arizona intrigue is all the talk about Arizona Senator Mark Kelly potentially being a running mate. He's done well here statewide, is generally viewed as a moderate. But does the vice president really help in a state? And what are you seeing, again, kind of with what you've heard on the street amongst other pollsters and what your past polls have told you?
Yeah, no, when you have a VP pick, it usually doesn't have a big impact on the overall vote. Because you remember, for example, in the 2020 election, Biden picked Kamala, which Biden ran as a moderate Democrat. Kamala hailing from California, which is considered quite liberal, right? So she was considered, a very different type. It didn't really impact the race so much, especially given Biden's age, and then if something happened, she'd take over. So that didn't really happen. And remember, she wasn't exactly super well liked there. But I think you'd see an impact with it with like Mark Kelly, because now you have one of your home state people running, right? But also Mark Kelly, not only is he in the running, he's received one of the packets that have been sent out for the vetting process of VP candidates. I know you and I didn't get one.
No, I didn't.
No. So right now, I think who's likely going to be the VP is either going to be Shapiro, a governor out of a key battleground state, Gretchen Whitmer out of Michigan, another battleground state, and then Mark Kelly in Arizona, battleground state. So he's got decent odds, frankly, and he's received a packet, so he's in the running. But when you look at it, it actually makes a lot of sense to pick Mark Kelly because he really balances out Kamala well. He's an astronaut. There's really no other thing that's more popular than that. His numbers, he's literally has the best polling numbers of like a candidate's image or favorability of any other elected official in the state of Arizona. We know that because we do every 2 years of power rankings or rate the top 50. So, and also he could raise money, but the bigger kicker, him and Kamala have a really great relationship. Anyways, I think it will have an impact, and I think it could, where I see it, I think it could have an impact down at the legislative level because the Republicans only have a 2-seat edge in the state Senate and the state House. The Democrats haven't held a majority there in 4 decades. There is a chance, especially in a presidential year, Kelly being there, that really juices turnout, and also maybe get some more voters to cross over that are maybe anti-Trump or kind of that McCain wing of the party. So that's actually what I think is most interesting is the impact to Arizona specifically, is if Kelly gets the pick, I feel like that could have actually a pretty big impact.
So I know you've worked with campaigns in the past, and obviously you do a lot of polling. With Mark Kelly getting that packet and being vetted as someone who could potentially become a vice presidential candidate, does the campaign, in this case the Harris campaign, do they do internal polling? How does he look to voters? Forget does he have skeletons in his closet part of the vetting, but do they look at other things like polling, which would be your area, and we won't ask you to blink twice or anything if you've ever done that kind of polling.
Well, no, 100%. That's why they gave time. They said, hey, we're going to make our pick, I think, around middle of August, right? So about 3 weeks from now. And they sent out the packets about a week ago. So it's about the time you need, about a month to vet candidates, right? But you can bet your bottom dollar that they will be pulling the heck out of this stuff to see the impacts. But I would gander, because of polling Mark Kelly stuff in the past, it's going to come out pretty good because, again, his profile. Like think of candidates as products, and as a product, what is your resume? He's an astronaut. He's a veteran. He's flown in combat, right? He's also the husband to a wife who was a congresswoman or a public servant who got shot in the face and lived and supported her all throughout that. And so, especially with Trump's attempt, that is a counterweight balance to that argument. And so when you look at it from a profile perspective, and he comes off more even keel than maybe Kamala might. And so again, I feel like he's going to test pretty well because look no further. He was an astronaut.
That's a tough one to beat. That really is. You can find combat veterans, to balance, but astronaut's a tough one.
Try to find me a group of people that are like, I'm anti-astronaut. Seriously. You got anti-everything else. Heck, you got flat earthers out there, right? Maybe flat earthers. Maybe flat earthers could be the ones that are very much against astronauts. But aside from that small, very microcosm of the electorate, here's the thing, is that astronauts, it doesn't get much more American than that.
So looking longer term at this race, we've got 100 or so days left until ballot counting starts. Knowing what we know, and who knows what's going to happen, in between. We've had 2 events happen in the last 2 weeks that nobody saw coming. But does Arizona, do you think, tighten up?
Potentially. I think the biggest thing what we're seeing right now is that we're in this hyper-polarized electorate. So, for example, when the attempted assassination attempt on Reagan went up 20 points in the polls. It was a very different political climate than is now, where we're seeing the highest rates of hyper-partisanship. So the two sides really dug in. And so you saw what? Trump dodged a bullet basically, and what? He got like a point bump, but that happened right around the time the RNC convention. It basically didn't move. But it's really, I think this election, there's very few, if any, voters that don't have an opinion. So it's not so much the swing voter. I think it's really going to come to turnout of the respective bases. And right now, Republicans are fully unified. They came out of that RNC convention ready to go. Democrats, and that's been their problem, they're not fully unified. They weren't really settled on Biden. That was clear in the polling. And now you have Kamala, but she still has some hurdles to get through. Basically, I'd say to tell the folks, try not to pay too much attention to the polls, this, that, and the other. Wait till after the convention, which is towards the end of August, because one is she get picked in the convention, looks likely she will be, but basically after that convention, because it's really, is that party unified? Because they have the numerical advantage over Republicans, Democrats do. But the thing is, they have to be united. And right now they're not. So I think that's the big thing. And that's what they're trying to do. But I think Arizona could tie, but we got to wait to see if that happens. If it doesn't, I don't think the race really changes much. If it does, I think it gets a little more competitive and it becomes a close one. But hence why we are a battleground state. We're going to be one of the 6 states that ultimately decides who sits in the most powerful office in the world.
In the meantime, hold on to your TVs and internet. The ads are coming to Arizona.
Oh, record amount. We're number 2 in the country, but arguably we see the most, Arizonans will see the most ads than anyone else in the country.
Mike, thanks for spending some time with us.
Of course. Anyways, appreciate you and always happy to help. Thanks for reaching out, Chris.
That was pollster and CEO of Noble Predictive Insights, Mike Noble. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, we'll explore the precedent of these unprecedented political times. Stay with us.
Here at Shortwave Space Camp, we escape our everyday lives to explore the mysteries and quirks of the universe. We find weird, fun, interesting stories that explain how the cosmos is partying all around us. From stars to dwarf planets to black holes and beyond, we've got you. Listen now to the Shortwave Podcast from NPR.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week we're looking at the presidential race through the lens of Arizona and history. Dr. Laura Brown is a political scientist and election analyst. She's also the author of 2 books about presidential campaigns and history. Vice President Harris now has enough pledged delegates to be nominated as the Democratic Party's presidential candidate at the convention later this month, but nothing is for sure until those votes are cast and counted. So we started our discussion with Dr. Brown talking about the possibility of an open convention.
I thought it was naive to believe that the Democrats had an appetite to have a debate over who their nominee was after having such a vigorous debate over whether President Biden should step away. That just doesn't make sense at the Democratic Party level. All politicians know that there are times to be what I call strategically altruistic, meaning that they are realizing that it is in their self-interest to put the party before their own ambition. And that happens infrequently, but it does happen, and it is part of what creates actually partisan coalitions and partisan unity. Not only did I think it was naive, but I also thought that it was really kind of wrong-headed, because Vice President Kamala Harris had not only been chosen in 2020 to be, in fact, the replacement should President Biden step away or pass away while he was in the presidency. She was constitutionally next in line. But it is also the case that when delegates and voters were coming together during the primary process, no one thought that President Biden was going to select anyone else as his vice president other than Harris. So she was always in the minds of Democrats, the person who would step in would Joe Biden suddenly become unavailable.
So the last time we saw an incumbent decide not to run for a second term, I believe was LBJ. That was different. That was in March, not 100 and change days out. How does this play out?
Well, I think this is very different than 1968. Again, I think this is where the historical analogy just falls apart. If you look at 1968, President Johnson was embattled over Vietnam. He had absolutely put all of his efforts into escalating that war. There were, protests in the United States over that. He had competition in the primaries over that. And then there was also civil rights that was roiling the nation at that moment. And so he stepped away at the end of March, partially also for health reasons. He had expressed some concerns about that privately. There was really no other process except for him to turn over his delegates to his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And that, within a sort of divided Democratic Party, created a lot of problems. You also had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April, and then the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in June. And both of those things happened before the Chicago Convention. In other words, the Democrats could not have been more divided and more sort of at odds with each other over what the direction for the party was when they showed up in Chicago than they were.
You bring up the assassinations in 1968. Well, here we are in 2024. We had an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate who happened to be a former president also. So that seemed to have maybe been a turning point in the election. But then a week later, we had the incumbent say, well, never mind, I'm not going to run and I'm pulling out. Do those two now cancel each other out and we just clear the table and hold on because here we go? Or does that assassination attempt play in? What's your thought on this unprecedented craziness?
Well, the assassination attempt was certainly a terrifying and tragic moment for our country. Not only was there a life lost in Pennsylvania and others wounded, but it really speaks to just this sense of how out of control, at least for Democrats, gun violence has become in the United States. I mean, everything that we know about the shooter, this was not necessarily political. I do think that the shooter was looking for a way to be seen. And in this day and age, a school shooting, a shooting at a theater, or a shooting at a concert doesn't seem to rise to the level of notoriety that it appears the shooter wanted to obtain. And, he likely did know that if you attempt to take the life of a president, you will go down in history because presidents go down in history. I mean, I can also just say that I do think that we're in a different moment in that other assassination attempts were at times when we had less polarization, at least in the modern era. And so figures of both political parties may have been disliked or liked, but they were not kind of universally held as unacceptable to voters. And so there was a sense that the country came together in sympathy over this tragedy. And I don't think that, sadly, we are in that kind of a moment. If you just look at the favorability ratings of both President Biden and former President Donald Trump, they are net negative, and that makes them generally unsympathetic figures even for something as tragic as an assassination attempt.
We're coming towards the crucial part of the campaign. We know from 4 years ago, this probably will be a very, very tight campaign. In swing states like Arizona, which went for Biden last time but hadn't gone for a Democrat since Bill Clinton, generally a red state, but as you know and our listeners know, we do have our own drum here and we tend to march to it. How does all of this play in a really tight election, especially in swing states like Arizona?
Well, the most important part about the change to Harris from Biden is that she reinvigorates the Democratic base. Whether we're talking about people of color or women or young voters, she is going to galvanize support toward the Democratic Party, which had been waning and really not just existent for almost the last year. So I do think that she is important in bringing the Democratic Party to parity with where the Republican Party is. The Republicans have been enthusiastic. Donald Trump's base is ready to be there for him. So I think what we are seeing this summer is that both parties are now kind of going to have doubled down on their base. They will be at parity. And the real question is going to be what happens after Labor Day when, moderately interested and marginally aligned voters kind of tune into the race and decide where they're going to put their thumb on the scale. And this is where I think the Democrats' appeal ends up being broader than the Republicans, partly because all indications in the party suggest that she is going to be looking toward a moderate vice presidential pick.
You bring up that vice presidential issue, and of course in Arizona, all of a sudden everybody is paying attention because one of our U.S. senators, Mark Kelly's name is in the mix. But in a race like this that A, is so close, and B, all the factors we've been talking about that are so unprecedented, does the vice presidential pick end up mattering? And really, does it ever matter?
Most people vote for the top of the ticket. And very few people actually make their decisions on the vice presidential picks. That said, we were in a situation where both presidential nominees were so elderly that the vice presidential picks mattered because many Americans were saying, are these guys really going to make it another 4 years? Maybe what I'm really making a choice over is who's going to ascend to the office should the person at the top of the ticket actually pass away. And this is, again, why I think Harris was well positioned to take over because so many had already contemplated that possibility. With that said, I do think voters are going to be looking at Harris's pick more than in a normal circumstance because it will be an indication of where she wants to lead the country. It will provide a signal in a very short campaign of who she is and what matters to her. And this is where I would argue that as much as Senator Kelly is a compelling vice presidential candidate, I think the biggest knock against him is that he is a senator. That then would make the ticket a ticket of insiders against a ticket of outsiders. And at this moment, outsiders do have something of kind of a claim on the American imagination.
Well, even as Vice President Harris runs her campaign, we've seen a couple of times, when the vice president ascends for whatever reason, there seems to be a feeling of obligation, at least for a little while, to continue the president's policies because of the way this went down. is Harris under any public obligation, whether she actually is or not, but public perception obligation, to continue Biden-era policies, or can she move out on her own?
Well, I do think she will move out on her own, especially on, the issue of abortion. But I also imagine she is going to really be making a case for Biden's record. It is her record as well, and she will want to defend sort of the bipartisan legislation that was passed and really the economic changes that are leading to a very strong sort of recovery. And though there is more work to do, and many Americans don't yet feel as though the economy has improved, there are real signs and real signals that the economy is stronger now than it was during most of President Trump's term, even excluding the time of the COVID pandemic.
That was political scientist Dr. Laura Brown. It's worth noting that if Senator Kelly is picked to be the vice presidential nominee, and if Democrats win the White House, Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs would appoint a Democrat to fill his seat until the next general election in 2026. Arizona law says the governor, when they appoint someone to be in the Senate, cannot change that party. If that happens, this would be Arizona's 6th consecutive general election where voters are asked to pick a U.S. senator. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org.